"Pack your bags and get out of my building." The arrogant CEO sneered, signing my termination papers. He had no idea my sudden exit would legally evict their $120 million key client portfolio by Monday morning. Ryan Caldwell, the 33-year-old CEO who inherited his position through pure nepotism, had slammed his hand on the mahogany boardroom table. He smirked, flanked by the expensive corporate lawyers he had hired to strip me of my 15 years of hard work. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I just picked up my leather briefcase, signed the termination papers, and walked out. Ryan thought he had just saved his company a $1.2 million commission payout. He had no idea he had just signed the death warrant of his family's business. To understand how we got to this boardroom showdown, you have to go back 15 years. In 2011, I was hired as a senior analyst by Richard Caldwell, Ryan's father. Back then, Crestview Advisory Group was a scrappy boutique advisory firm operating out of a cramped office in downtown Chicago, generating barely $15 million in annual recurring revenue. Richard was a brilliant old-school operator who understood that in the high-stakes world of corporate advisory, relationships are everything. He saw something in me, a drive to build trust rather than just chase transactions. Over the next decade and a half, I did not just work for Crestview, I built it. I worked 80-hour weeks, flew across the country at a moment's notice to resolve client crises, and sacrificed weekends with my family. My efforts paid off. By 2025, Crestview had grown into a powerhouse, managing over $150 million in annual recurring revenue. My personal portfolio was the crown jewel of the company. I managed the firm's three largest accounts, Omni Group, Vertex Systems, and Apex Logistics. Together, these three giants generated $120 million in annual recurring revenue. That was 80% of Crestview's entire business. These were not just names on a spreadsheet. They were massive corporations with complex operational needs. I had spent years building deep personal relationships with their executive leadership. Victoria Sinclair, the chief operating officer of Omni Group, did not call Crestview when she needed strategic advice. She called my personal cell phone. The same was true for Leonard Brody at Vertex Systems and Christian Howard at Apex Logistics. They trusted me implicitly because I had navigated them through major restructurings, supply chain crises, and market downturns. Because of my value to the firm, Richard Caldwell had granted me a handsome compensation package. I received a base salary of $350,000. A contractually guaranteed 1% performance commission on the revenue generated by my portfolio, and a 5% equity stake in Crestview, which was set to vest fully at the end of 2026. With the company's valuation hovering around $80 million, that 5% equity was worth a cool $4 million. I had earned every single penny of it. Richard knew this, and he always treated me like a partner. But in early 2024, Richard's health began to decline. At 66 years old, he decided it was time to step down as CEO and retire to his estate in Florida, leaving the daily operations to his son, Ryan. Ryan Caldwell was a textbook example of inherited privilege. Armed with a vanity business degree from an expensive private university and an insufferable sense of entitlement, he arrived at the office determined to make his mark. He did not care about the years of hard work it took to build Crestview. To Ryan, the company was his personal playground, and the senior staff were just expensive overhead. He quickly replaced several experienced department heads with his golf buddies and younger, cheaper hires who would not challenge his authority. I watched this transition with growing concern. But I kept my head down and focused on my clients. As long as my portfolio remained secure, I figured I could tolerate Ryan's arrogance. However, the dynamic shifted as we approached the summer of 2026. My performance commission of $1.2 million was due for payout in September, and my 5% equity was scheduled to vest in December. Ryan, eager to impress the board of directors and boost the company's short-term profitability, saw my compensation as a massive financial drain. He did not understand the concept of client loyalty. In his mind, the clients belonged to Crestview, not to me. He believed that once I was gone, the clients would simply continue paying their fees, and he could pocket the $1.2 million while clawing back my $4 million in equity. What Ryan failed to realize was that as I had spent 15 years studying contract law and corporate strategy, when I personally negotiated the multi-year renewal agreements for Omni Group, Vertex Systems, and Apex Logistics back in 2023, I knew that a leadership change was inevitable. I had anticipated that a young, incompetent successor might try to disrupt our operations. Therefore, I insisted on inserting a very specific clause into each of those contracts. It was a standard industry protection known as a key man clause. The clause was simple but absolute. It stated that Victor Vance was the designated relationship director for the account, and if Victor Vance was no longer actively managing the relationship due to termination, resignation, or reassignment, the client reserved the right to terminate their service agreement immediately with a 10-day written notice, without any early termination penalties. Richard Caldwell had signed off on those contracts without hesitation, understanding that the clients would not have signed with Crestview otherwise. But Ryan, in his rush to assume control, had never actually read the fine print of the client agreements. He only looked at the top-line numbers and the expiration dates. He assumed the clients were locked in for another 3 years, regardless of who was running the account. This lack of diligence was the first of many fatal mistakes Ryan would make, and it set the stage for a corporate collapse of epic proportions. The storm began to gather in early August 2026. It started with a series of subtle changes in office protocol. I noticed that my access to the internal financial forecasting database had been restricted, and some of the weekly operational meetings with Crestview's executive committee were rescheduled without my knowledge. When I asked Roger Davis, the chief financial officer and Ryan's loyal accomplice, about these discrepancies, he brushed them off as minor technical glitches. Roger was a career bureaucrat in his mid-50s who had survived multiple leadership transitions by always aligning himself with whoever held the power. He knew exactly what Ryan was planning, and he was more than willing to help orchestrate my downfall if it meant securing his own position and a share of the clawed-back assets. On the morning of August 11th, I received a calendar invitation for an urgent meeting in the main boardroom. The subject line was simply labeled Operational Review. When I entered the room, I found Ryan Caldwell sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Roger Davis and 2 external attorneys from a high-priced corporate defense firm. The atmosphere in the room was cold and clinical. I took a seat opposite Ryan, placing my notebook on the table. Ryan did not waste time with pleasantries. He pushed a thick manila folder across the table toward me. Inside was a compilation of email logs and document transfer history. Ryan leaned back in his chair, a smug grin playing on his lips. He explained that a routine compliance audit had flagged a serious security breach. According to their logs, I had transmitted confidential company financial models and proprietary client restructuring templates to an external email address. Ryan claimed this was a direct violation of my non-disclosure agreement and a material breach of my employment contract under Section 9, which governed proprietary data security. I looked at the documents. The external email address listed was info@vancelegalpartners.com. I shook my head slightly. I explained to Ryan and Roger that this was the email address of Sarah Jenkins, my personal legal counsel. I had sent her a copy of my own employment agreement and my historical commission statements, so she could review my upcoming equity vesting schedule. No client data had been shared, and no proprietary financial models were transmitted. I was simply sharing my personal compensation records with my attorney. But Ryan was not interested in the truth. This was the loophole he had been searching for. He stated that the board of directors had reviewed the audit findings and determined that my actions constituted a termination for cause. Because the termination was for cause, the company was exercising its right to nullify my upcoming $1.2 million performance commission. Furthermore, under the terms of the equity incentive plan, my unvested 5% equity stake in Crestview Advisory Group was immediately forfeited and clawed back by the company. Roger Davis chimed in, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He added that the firm would also be enforcing the 2-year non-compete covenant in my contract. He warned me that if I attempted to contact Omni Group, Vertex Systems, or Apex Logistics, or if I tried to seek employment with any competing advisory firm in the tri-state area, Crestview would immediately file an injunction and sue me for damages. They wanted to make sure I was completely neutralized, unable to defend myself or rebuild my career. I sat in silence for a moment, looking at Ryan and Roger. I could see the triumph in Ryan's eyes. He thought he had outsmarted the veteran. He believed he had saved the company $5.2 million with a simple compliance trick. He expected me to yell, to threaten legal action, or to beg for a severance package that would have given him the satisfaction of showing his power. Instead, I took a deep breath, closed the folder, and placed it back on the table. I looked Ryan directly in the eyes. I told him that I understood his position. I stated that if the firm believed it had grounds for a cause termination, then there was no point in arguing in this room. I stood up, smoothed down my suit jacket, and picked up my briefcase. I told them I would cooperate fully with the departure process and would expect my final paycheck, including my accrued vacation time, to be deposited into my account by the end of the day, as required by state law. Ryan's grin faltered slightly. My calm response was not the reaction he had anticipated. He stammered for a second, telling me that security would escort me to my office to gather my personal belongings and then lead me out of the building. I nodded and told him that would not be necessary, as my office only contained a few personal books and my coffee mug, which I could easily carry myself. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the Crestview office building and into the warm August air. I did not feel panic or anger. In fact, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Ryan had spent months planning this ambush, believing that his legal team had built an airtight case. What he did not realize was that by terminating me for cause under false pretenses, he had committed a material breach of my employment agreement. And in the world of contract law, a material breach by one party immediately excuses the other party from their obligations under the contract. My non-compete covenant was now legally dead, and the keyman clauses in the client contracts were about to be triggered. The chessboard was set, and Ryan had just made his first move. The moment I stepped onto the street, I called Sarah Jenkins. Within an hour, I was sitting in her office on the 45th floor of a skyscraper overlooking Millennium Park. Sarah was a sharp, seasoned employment attorney who had spent decades representing high-level corporate executives. I laid out the termination documents, the email logs, and my original employment contract on her desk. Sarah reviewed the paperwork, a cold smile forming on her face. She explained that Ryan's legal team had made a monumental blunder. Attorney-client privilege is a fundamental legal right. Sharing my own employment contract and compensation details with my legal counsel for the purpose of financial planning and contract review could never be classified as a breach of confidentiality or a disclosure of trade secrets. By using this as a pretext for a cause termination, Crestview had committed a bad faith material breach of my employment agreement. Sarah explained the legal ramifications. Under well-established contract law, specifically the Restatement Second of Contracts, when one party commits a material breach of an agreement, the non-breaching party is immediately discharged from any further performance obligations under that agreement. In simple terms, because Crestview had wrongfully terminated me to avoid paying my commission and equity, they had invalidated the entire contract, including the 2-year non-compete covenant. We did not even need to wait for a lengthy trial. Sarah prepared a formal demand letter to Crestview's legal department and filed a motion for an expedited declaratory judgment in state court, asking a judge to officially rule the non-compete void due to prior material breach. With the non-compete legally neutralized, I was free to take the next step. I immediately registered a new business entity, Vance Advisory Partners. I set up a temporary office in a high-end co-working space and hired a junior graphic designer to create a simple professional website. I was not starting from scratch. I was simply relocating the foundation I had spent 15 years building. Next, I reached out to my contacts at the 3 major accounts that formed 80% of Crestview's revenue. I did not send mass emails. Instead, I made 3 personal phone calls. First, I called Victoria Sinclair, the Chief Operating Officer of Omni Group. I explained that I had been terminated from Crestview due to a management restructuring. I told her the truth about Ryan's attempt to claw back my equity and commission. Victoria was silent for a moment, then let out a sharp laugh. She told me that she had met Ryan once and found him to be an arrogant, incompetent boy who did not know the first thing about their business. She stated that Omni Group had stayed with View Crest solely because of my personal strategic oversight. She asked about the status of our current projects. I assured her that I was launching my own firm, Vance Advisory Partners, and that I would be able to continue managing their account without any disruption. I reminded her of Section 12.4 of Omni Group's service agreement with Crestview, the Keyman Clause. Victoria immediately understood. She told me that she would have her legal team review the clause and draft a termination notice to Crestview. She stated that Omni Group would not risk their $60 million portfolio under Ryan's unproven leadership. Next, I called Leonard Brody, the executive vice president of Vertex Systems. Leonard was an analytical, no-nonsense executive who valued operational stability above all else. When I told him about my departure, he was deeply concerned. Vertex was in the middle of a complex $40 million corporate restructuring that I was personally directing. Leonard knew that if a junior Crestview analyst took over the project, it could result in catastrophic delays. When I explained that I could transition the project seamlessly to my new firm and that he could invoke the Keyman Clause to exit his agreement with Crestview, Leonard did not hesitate. He told me that he would instruct his legal department to draft the notice immediately. Finally, I called Christian Howard, the president of Apex Logistics. Christian was a close personal friend whom I had known for over 10 years. He was furious when he heard how Ryan had treated me. He told me that Richard Caldwell would be ashamed of his son's actions. Christian stated that Apex Logistics would pull their $20 million account from Crestview immediately. He told me to send over the new service agreements for Vance Advisory Partners and that his team would sign them as soon as their 10-day notice period with Crestview expired. By Friday afternoon, all 3 clients had finalized their termination notices. The letters were drafted by some of the top corporate law firms in the country, citing the specific Keyman provisions in their agreements and giving Crestview the contractually required 10 days notice of termination. The grounds were clear. Victor Vance was no longer the active relationship director, and the clients were exercising their right to terminate the contracts with 0 penalties. I sat in my new office, looking at the draft copies of the notices. Ryan Caldwell and Roger Davis had spent months plotting to steal my $1.2 million commission and claw back my $4 million in equity. They had focused so much on the legal jargon of my employment contract that they had completely ignored the operational reality of the client contracts. They had cut the throat of the man who kept the engine running, and now they were about to watch the fuel run out. On Monday morning, August 17, 2026, the storm officially hit Crestview Advisory Group. At exactly 9 o'clock, 3 separate couriers delivered certified letters to the receptionist on the top floor of the Crestview headquarters. Copies were simultaneously emailed to Ryan Caldwell, Roger Davis, and the head of the legal department. The notices were short, precise, and legally devastating. Omni Group, Vertex Systems, and Apex Logistics were exercising their rights under Section 12.4 of their respective master service agreements. Due to the termination of Victor Vance, the designated keyman, they were giving their 10-day notices of contract termination. Within minutes, the executive floor at Crestview descended into absolute chaos. Employees later told me that Ryan's office door remained slammed shut, but his shouting could be heard all the way down the hall. He had summoned Roger Davis and the internal legal team. He demanded to know how this was possible, screaming that the clients were under multi-year contracts and could not simply walk away. The head of legal, a quiet man who had tried to warn Ryan weeks earlier, calmly pointed out the Keyman clauses that Richard Caldwell had signed off on years ago. The financial reality was catastrophic. Crestview's total annual recurring revenue was $150 million. The 3 departing clients represented $120 million of that total. Overnight, 80% of the company's revenue had vanished. To make matters worse, Crestview had recently taken out a $30 million expansion loan from a major commercial bank. That loan carried strict financial covenants. One of the primary covenants required Crestview to maintain a minimum of $100 million in annual recurring revenue. By dropping to $30 million, Crestview was in immediate default of its loan agreement. The bank had the right to call in the entire $30 million debt immediately, a move that would force Crestview into involuntary bankruptcies. My phone began ringing at 9:45. It was Ryan. I let it ring. He called 3 more times in the span of 10 minutes, followed by a series of increasingly frantic text messages. He wrote that we needed to talk, that there had been a misunderstanding, and that he was willing to negotiate a generous severance package. I did not respond. When he realized I would not answer, Ryan called Sarah Jenkins. He demanded an emergency meeting at her office. Sarah checked my schedule and told him we could accommodate him at 2 o'clock that afternoon, provided he brought Roger Davis and the firm's lead legal counsel. At 2 o'clock sharp, Ryan and Roger walked into Sarah's conference room. The contrast between this meeting and our last boardroom encounter was stark. Ryan's arrogant posture was gone. His tie was slightly askew, and he had dark circles under his eyes. Roger looked pale, clutching a folder of financial projections that now looked like a suicide note. Ryan did not wait to sit down before he started talking. He told me that he wanted to put the past behind us. He offered to reinstate me immediately as Senior Managing Director of Crestview. He promised to pay my $1.2 million commission in full by the end of the week, and he offered to accelerate the vesting of my 5% equity stake, raising it to 7% as a gesture of goodwill. He even suggested that we could create a new co-CDO structure, allowing me to run the operational side of the business while he focused on strategic growth. I let him finish. I sat in silence for a few seconds, letting the desperation in the room settle. Then I shook my head. I told Ryan that his offer was too late. I explained that I was no longer an employee of Crestview Advisory Group, and I had no interest in returning. I told him that I had already launched my own firm, Vance Advisory Partners, and that Omni Group, Vertex Systems, and Apex Logistics had already executed new service agreements with my company effective the moment their 10-day notice periods with Crestview expired. Ryan's face turned red. He slammed his fist on the table, though with far less force than he had used in the boardroom. He shouted that I had violated my non-compete, that I had stolen Crestview's clients, and that he would sue me for every penny I had. He screamed that I was destroying his father's legacy. Sarah Jenkins stepped in, her voice calm and authoritative. She slid a copy of our court filing across the table. She explained to Ryan and his counsel that by terminating me for cause under a fabricated compliance pretext, Crestview had committed a material breach of my employment agreement. She cited the relevant case law, explaining that a party in material breach cannot enforce the restrictive covenants of the contract they violated. She told Ryan's lawyers that if they filed a lawsuit, we would countersue for wrongful termination, breach of contract, and tortious interference, and we would seek punitive damages. Ryan's legal counsel looked at the filing, then leaned over and whispered to Ryan. I watched Ryan's shoulders slump as his own attorney explained that they had no legal leg to stand on. The non-compete was dead, the clients were gone, and the bank loan was about to default. I looked at Ryan and told him that Richard Caldwell's legacy was built on trust and mutual respect, two concepts Ryan had never bothered to learn. I told him that I did not destroy Crestview, his own greed did. I stood up, thanked them for their time, and left the room. The confrontation was over. Ryan had come to negotiate, but he had nothing left to offer. The 10-day transition period passed like a blur of corporate restructuring and quiet celebration. By the end of August 2026, Omni Group, Vertex Systems, and Apex Logistics had officially moved their accounts to Vance Advisory Partners. The transition was flawless. Because I had spent 15 years managing every detail of their operations, my new team and I did not miss a single beat. The clients did not experience a minute of downtime, and their strategic initiatives continued without a hitch. For Crestview Advisory Group, however, the departure of 80% of their business was a fatal blow. As expected, the commercial bank immediately declared a covenant default on the $30 million expansion loan. with the company's annual recurring revenue plummeted to just $30 million. Crestview had no way to service the debt, let alone cover their massive office lease in downtown Chicago and the salaries of their bloated executive staff. When the board of directors realized the extent of the disaster, they panicked. The board members, who had blindly supported Ryan's appointment as CEO, suddenly realized that their own shares were about to become worthless. They reached out to Richard Caldwell, the retired founder, pleading with him to return and save the firm from bankruptcy. Richard Caldwell flew back to Chicago from Florida the following week. He was 68 years old, and he had spent his entire life building Crestview. Seeing the company he loved reduced to near bankruptcy by his own son's greed was a devastating blow. Richard did not waste time. His first act upon returning was to call an emergency board meeting. In that meeting, he officially removed Ryan Caldwell from the position of CEO, citing gross mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. Ryan was stripped of all operational authority and sent packing, his corporate career over before it had truly begun. Richard then turned his attention to Roger Davis, the complicit CFO, and terminated him on the spot. Once the internal house cleaning was complete, Richard reached out to me. He did not call my lawyer. He called my personal cell phone. His voice was tired and heavy with regret. He asked if we could meet for coffee at the quiet diner near our old office, where we used to celebrate closing major accounts. We met the next morning. Richard looked older than his 68 years. He did not try to make excuses for Ryan. He looked me in the eyes and apologized. He told me that he was deeply ashamed of how his son had treated me and that he had never intended for my 15 years of loyalty to be rewarded with betrayal. He acknowledged that Ryan's for-cause termination was a shameful lie, manufactured solely to steal my commission and claw back my equity. Richard explained that Crestview was in a desperate position. The bank was threatening foreclosure, and the company was facing a massive wrongful termination lawsuit from my legal team. Richard proposed a settlement. He offered to pay my $1.2 million performance commission in full. In addition, to settle the equity dispute and avoid a public court battle that would destroy whatever reputation Crestview had left, he offered a cash buyout of my 5% equity stake. The buyout would be valued at $3.8 million, representing a fair market valuation of the equity prior to Ryan's mismanagement. In total, the settlement offer was $5 million, to be paid in cash within 48 hours. In exchange, I would drop my lawsuit and sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement. I looked at my former mentor. I saw a father who was trying to salvage what was left of his life's work and clean up his son's mess. I had no desire to destroy Richard, and the $5 million settlement was exactly what I was owed. I agreed to the terms. 2 days later, the wire transfer cleared. The $5 million was deposited into my corporate account. It was a sweet victory. The money was a tangible acknowledgement of my 15 years of dedication, but the true prize was the independence I had gained. Today, Vance Advisory Partners is thriving. We operate out of a modern, light-filled office in Chicago. We manage $120 million in recurring revenue, and I own 100% of the firm. My clients are happy, my team is well compensated, and we are growing month by month. As for Crestview, Richard Caldwell managed to negotiate a restructuring plan with the bank, saving the company from liquidation. But the firm is a shadow of its former self. It has been downgraded to a minor third-tier advisory boutique, struggling to compete in a market that once belonged to them. Ryan Caldwell is currently living in Florida, cut off from the family trust, and barred from holding any executive position in a public company. Sometimes, I look back at my 15 years at Crestview. I do not feel bitterness. The corporate chess game that Ryan tried to play was ruthless, but he forgot the fundamental rule of business. You can steal a title, you can steal a desk, and you can even steal a folder of files. But you can never steal the trust, the relationships, and the competence of the person who built the business. In the end, corporate politics and nepotism will always crumble under the weight of their own incompetence. Competence always wins.